December 1941. The island of Oahu still trembled with the echoes of conflict as smoke continued to rise from the harbor. Japanese naval aviators, who had been captured during operations against American installations, found themselves confined in makeshift detention facilities, their minds still processing the reality of their situation. These men, trained to believe that capture meant eternal dishonor, prepared themselves for the brutal treatment they had been conditioned to expect from their enemies. What actually awaited them would shatter every assumption they had been taught about the Americans and about warfare itself. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 3 years, these prisoners would experience something so contrary to their military indoctrination that many would struggle to comprehend it. And their journey from warriors to farmers would reveal truths about humanity that transcended the boundaries of conflict. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki had been the first Japanese prisoner of the conflict, captured when his midget submarine ran aground near Bellows Field. As he was processed into custody in early 1942, every fiber of his being expected the worst possible treatment. Instead, he was offered medical attention, clean clothing, and food. The disconnect between expectation and reality was so profound that he initially refused to eat, convinced the meals were poisoned or part of some elaborate psychological torment. Marine Sergeant William Chen, a Chinese-American guard assigned to the detention facility at Sand Island, observed the newly arrived prisoners with a mixture of professional detachment and genuine curiosity. He had been briefed on Japanese military culture and understood that these men viewed their capture as the ultimate shame. What he could not have anticipated was how his daily interactions with them would evolve over the coming months. The initial detention camp on Sand Island, located in Honolulu Harbor, housed approximately 150 Japanese prisoners by mid-1942. Most were naval personnel, with a smaller number of Army soldiers who had been part of various Pacific operations. The camp commandant, Colonel Harold Thompson, a career officer who had served in the previous world conflict, maintained strict security protocols while simultaneously ensuring that conditions met all requirements of international agreements regarding prisoner treatment. Sakamaki kept a clandestine journal written in tiny characters on scraps of paper he managed to conceal. His early entries reflected his mental state with stark clarity. He wrote of his shame, his certainty that his family would never recover from the dishonor he had brought them, and his confusion at the respectful manner in which the guards treated him. As the prisoner population grew through 1942 and into 1943, the military authorities faced a practical challenge. Housing and feeding hundreds of prisoners on an island where resources were stretched thin by mobilization efforts required creative solutions. Additionally, the Hawaiian agricultural industry faced severe labor shortages as local workers enlisted or took positions in defense industries. The solution proposed by the civilian government seemed almost absurd to military planners. Put the prisoners to work on pineapple plantations. Captain Robert Morrison, liaison between military and civilian authorities, presented the proposal to Colonel Thompson in March 1943. Thompson's initial response was skeptical. He questioned how trained Japanese military personnel could be safely deployed to agricultural fields, expressing concerns about escape attempts or sabotage. Morrison had anticipated this concern. He explained that the men had nowhere to go on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest Japanese-held territory. More importantly, international protocols allowed for prisoner work programs, and the farms desperately needed labor. The initial trial program began in April 1943, with 30 prisoners selected for work at the Dole Plantation Fields in central Oahu. Sergeant Chen volunteered to be part of the guard detachment overseeing the work program, partly from duty and partly from genuine interest in how this unusual arrangement would unfold. When the prisoners were first informed they would be working on pineapple farms, the reaction among them was complex and varied. Petty Officer Hiroshi Nakamura, a gunner who had served aboard a carrier, later recalled his immediate thoughts about believing it was mockery, that Americans were trying to humiliate prisoners rather than treating them as warriors. Being sent to pick fruit like farmers seemed designed to strip away their dignity as military men. Corporal Takeshi Yamada, a former infantryman, shared similar sentiments. He thought they were being made into jokes, turning soldiers into field workers. In Japan, they revered the warrior tradition. Farm work was honest but not honorable for a military man. The first morning at the plantation revealed the disconnect between perception and reality. The prisoners were transported in trucks to vast fields of pineapple plants stretching toward distant mountains. They were issued work gloves, wide-brimmed hats for sun protection, and canteens of water. The civilian foreman, a Portuguese Hawaiian named Manuel Santos, who had managed plantation workers for 20 years, addressed them through an interpreter. Santos was direct and practical. He explained that pineapple harvesting was skilled labor, requiring them to judge ripeness, cut properly to avoid damaging plants, and handle the fruit without injuring themselves on the sharp leaves. Work a full day and receive 3 meals, adequate rest and fair treatment. Refuse to work or cause problems, and return to confinement. Sergeant Chen watched the prisoners' faces carefully as the terms were explained. He saw confusion, suspicion, and what might have been the first hints of curiosity. These men had been prepared for brutality, not negotiation. The work was indeed demanding. Pineapple plants have sharp, spiny leaves that could slice unprotected skin. The fruit itself, weighing several pounds each when mature, had to be cut at precisely the right point to avoid damaging the plant's ability to produce subsequent crops. The Hawaiian sun beat down mercilessly, and the volcanic soil was rocky and uneven. Nakamura found the first day almost unbearable, not from physical difficulty, but from psychological dissonance. They worked alongside civilian laborers, mostly Filipino and Portuguese workers, who showed them techniques and corrected their mistakes without cruelty. One older Filipino man, named Vicente, told him about his own experience working these fields for 15 years, treating him as a fellow worker rather than as an enemy or prisoner. By the end of the first week, 30 prisoners had harvested approximately 12,000 pineapples. The plantation managers were impressed with their work ethic, though Santos noted in his reports that the prisoners seemed to approach the labor with almost desperate intensity, as though trying to prove something to themselves. As weeks turned into months, subtle transformations began occurring. The prisoners developed calluses and muscle strength specific to agricultural work. More significantly, they began developing relationships with civilian workers and guards based on shared daily experience rather than military hierarchy or national identity. Yamada recalled a particular incident in June 1943 that shifted his perspective fundamentally. He made an error cutting a pineapple plant and damaged the crown. He expected punishment, shame, perhaps violence. Instead, Vicente simply showed him the correct angle and depth for the cut, saying everyone makes this mistake when learning. Then he shared his lunch, rice and fish wrapped in leaves. They sat in the shade and Vicente told him about his family in the Philippines. For the first time since capture, Yamada felt like a human being rather than a failed soldier or an enemy. The military authorities gradually expanded the program as its success became evident. By August 1943, over 200 prisoners were working across multiple plantations and agricultural operations. Security incidents were virtually non-existent. No escapes were attempted, and productivity often exceeded that of civilian workers. Colonel Thompson noted in his monthly reports a phenomenon he struggled to articulate precisely. The prisoner work program had exceeded all operational expectations. More remarkably, they were observing behavioral changes among the prisoners that suggested a fundamental psychological shift. Men who initially refused to make eye contact now engaged in conversation. Several had requested English language materials. Sergeant Chen had developed a particular rapport with several prisoners, especially Sakamaki, whose English was better than most. During transportation back to the detention facility one evening, Chen asked Sakamaki directly what he thought about the work program. Sakamaki was quiet for a long moment before responding. In Japan, they were taught that Americans were weak, materialistic, without honor or discipline. They were told that if captured, they should expect terrible treatment. Every day here contradicted what they were taught to believe. Americans treated them according to rules and agreements, paid them small wages for work, provided medical care when they were injured. He did not understand how everything they were taught could be so completely wrong. Chen, whose own family had faced discrimination despite being American citizens, found himself reflecting on the complexity of the situation. Perhaps what they were taught was not about Americans at all, but about controlling them, making them willing to do anything by convincing them the alternative was worse than it actually is. This conversation stayed with Sakamaki. His hidden journal entries from this period show a man grappling with profound cognitive dissonance. One entry from September 1943 described harvesting 430 pineapples, noting his hands were strong and his body healthy despite imprisonment. The American sergeant treated him with more respect than some of his own officers did. The pineapple harvest season of 1943 was the most productive in Hawaii's agricultural history up to that point, with prisoner labor accounting for approximately 15% of the total workforce across multiple plantations. The economic impact was significant, but the human impact was more profound. Civilian workers began bringing small gifts to the prisoners, items that technically violated protocols but that guards often overlooked: a bar of soap, a magazine, a better quality work shirt. These gestures, small in themselves, represented a recognition of shared humanity that cut across the boundaries of conflict. Nakamura received a particularly meaningful gift in October 1943. An elderly Japanese-American woman who supervised packing operations at the plantation approached him during a break. She spoke to him in Japanese, the first time he had heard his native language from someone outside the prison population in nearly 2 years. She told him quietly that her son was fighting in Europe with the American army. She prayed every day that if he were captured, someone would treat him with kindness. So she would treat Nakamura with kindness and hope that karma balances. She handed him a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was a rice ball perfectly formed with pickled plum at the center. Nakamura wept, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition that humanity could persist even in circumstances of profound conflict. He later wrote to a friend that the rice ball taught him more about the nature of human beings than all his military training. An old woman whose son fought against his country showed him more honor than his own commanders, who sent them to certain failure without adequate preparation or support. As 1944 progressed, the prisoner work program expanded beyond pineapple harvesting to include other agricultural operations, infrastructure maintenance, and even skilled trades for those with relevant experience. A small group of prisoners with engineering backgrounds was assigned to help maintain irrigation systems, working alongside civilian technicians. The daily routine became almost normalized. Prisoners woke at dawn, ate breakfast, were transported to work sites, labored through the day with appropriate breaks, returned to detention facilities, ate dinner, and had evening hours for recreation, study, or rest. Colonel Thompson noted with some amazement in a report to higher command that they had created what amounts to a functioning community where former enemies work cooperatively toward shared goals. The prisoners were healthier, more productive, and less problematic than any detention population he had encountered in 30 years of military service. Not all prisoners adapted easily. Some remained rigidly committed to the ideology that had driven them to conflict, viewing cooperation or acceptance as betrayal. A small group of hardliners refused to work, accepted minimal rations, and isolated themselves from both guards and fellow prisoners who participated in the work programs. Corporal Kenji Watanabe was among this resistant group initially. He viewed the work program as a trick designed to break their spirits and turn them into collaborators. His influence waned over months as he watched fellow prisoners grow stronger and healthier while he weakened from inactivity and stress. The turning point for Watanabe came in February 1944 when he fell seriously ill with pneumonia. Despite his refusal to cooperate with camp programs, he received full medical treatment. An American military doctor, Captain Richard Hamilton, spent hours at his bedside, ensuring he received appropriate care, antibiotics, and monitoring. As Watanabe recovered, Hamilton spoke with him through an interpreter about the philosophy behind prisoner treatment. The doctor explained that they provided this care not to trick or break prisoners, but because their values required it. They had rules about how prisoners were treated because they believed all human beings deserved certain basic dignities. This conversation profoundly impacted Watanabe. He later wrote that it was the moment he began to understand that the American approach was not tactical, but philosophical, rooted in principles rather than immediate utility. Within a month, he volunteered for the work program and became one of the most dedicated participants. The agricultural work also provided unexpected educational opportunities. Many prisoners had grown up in urban areas of Japan and had limited exposure to farming beyond rice cultivation. Learning about pineapple cultivation, irrigation management, soil science, and crop rotation gave them skills and knowledge they had never anticipated acquiring. Yamada discovered he had an aptitude for agricultural planning. He worked with Santos and other plantation managers to optimize harvesting schedules and improve efficiency. His suggestions, initially offered tentatively, were seriously considered and sometimes implemented. In military service, Yamada had been one soldier among millions, following orders without question. On the plantation, his thoughts mattered. When he suggested a better way to organize the harvesting rotation to account for varying ripeness rates across different field sections, they listened. They tested his idea. It worked. By mid-1944, several hundred prisoners were employed across Hawaiian agriculture and related industries. The program had become institutionalized, with formal procedures for work assignments, wage payments into prisoner accounts, safety protocols, and performance evaluations. The cultural exchange worked in multiple directions. Prisoners taught civilian workers Japanese songs, shared stories about their home regions, and explained aspects of their culture. American guards and civilian supervisors learned to appreciate the discipline and precision the prisoners brought to their work. Sergeant Chen, who had been promoted to staff sergeant by this point, oversaw a work detail that included 23 prisoners. He had learned enough Japanese to communicate basic instructions without an interpreter, and several prisoners had learned enough English to handle routine interactions. One afternoon in June 1944, as Chen supervised a planting operation, Sakamaki approached him during a break with a question. When this conflict ends, what would happen to them? Would they be sent home? He struggled to imagine returning to Japan after everything he had experienced. Chen did not have easy answers. He suspected they would be repatriated eventually. As for how to explain the experience, perhaps they should not try to explain but just live according to what they learned. Treat people with the dignity they were shown. Question authorities who tell them that entire groups of people are less than human. This conversation represented a common theme among prisoners as 1944 progressed. Many grappled with the question of what their captivity experience meant for their understanding of themselves, their country, and their future. The pineapple plantations themselves became unintentional classrooms in practical philosophy. The work was honest, the results tangible, the treatment fair. These simple realities created a foundation for human connection that ideology and propaganda could not withstand. Nakamura, working alongside Filipino laborers who themselves had complex relationships with both Japanese and American authority, learned about the diversity of human experience. His co-worker Vicente had family in Manila living under Japanese occupation, yet Vicente treated Nakamura without personal animosity. Vicente's brother had perished during the fighting in the Philippines. He had every reason to hate Nakamura personally. Instead, he taught him his craft, shared his food, told him stories about his family. He showed Nakamura that it was possible to acknowledge terrible things while still choosing to treat individuals with decency. As 1945 arrived, and news of the conflict's progression filtered into the camp, the prisoners faced new uncertainties. The reality that Japan was not achieving the victories promised by their leadership became increasingly difficult to deny. Some prisoners responded to this reality with deepening depression. Others found themselves relieved, recognizing that perhaps their capture had saved them from eventual destruction. A few began to hope that the conflict's end might bring fundamental changes to their homeland. The work program continued through the spring and summer of 1945. Productivity remained high. The prisoners, now practiced in agricultural work, operated with the efficiency of experienced laborers rather than military personnel assigned to unfamiliar tasks. When news reached the camp in August 1945 that the conflict had ended, the response among prisoners was complex and varied. Some felt relief. Others felt shame that they had survived while so many of their comrades had perished. Many felt confusion about what came next. The process of repatriation took months. During this transition period, the work program continued, now with the surreal quality of former enemies working cooperatively while awaiting separation. The daily routines that had become normalized over years suddenly had the quality of temporary arrangements drawing to a close. Sergeant Chen found himself unexpectedly emotional as the prisoners he had supervised for years prepared to depart. He had watched men transform from angry, defeated warriors into skilled farmers and craftsmen. He had seen ideology give way to pragmatism, hatred dissolve into mutual respect. On one of the final days before repatriation shipments began in late 1945, Chen organized an informal gathering at the plantation. With permission from his superiors, he arranged for a shared meal between the guards, civilian workers, and prisoners who had worked together. Santos, the plantation foreman, spoke briefly. The men came as prisoners, but left as skilled agricultural workers who helped keep these islands fed during difficult times. They had his respect and his gratitude. Sakamaki, speaking on behalf of the prisoners, struggled with emotion. They came expecting cruelty and found dignity. They came as warriors and learned the value of peaceful productivity. They came believing Americans were their inferiors and discovered they were their teachers. What they learned here cannot be unlearned. The repatriation ships departed through late 1945 and early 1946. Hundreds of prisoners who had spent years working Hawaiian pineapple fields returned to a devastated Japan facing occupation, reconstruction, and fundamental restructuring. Many carried seeds, cuttings, and agricultural knowledge they had acquired. More importantly, they carried experiences that contradicted everything their military training had taught them. In the years following repatriation, several former prisoners maintained correspondence with guards, civilian workers, and supervisors they had known during captivity. Nakamura wrote to Vicente in 1948 about returning to farming in Japan, though they grew rice rather than pineapples. The techniques he learned in Hawaii served him well. More importantly, the lessons about human decency across cultural boundaries guided him as he tried to help rebuild his country. Yamada established a small agricultural cooperative using principles he had learned on the plantations. In a letter to Santos in 1950, he wrote about applying not just the technical knowledge, but the philosophical approach he observed in Hawaii. Fair treatment, clear expectations, shared purpose created better results than hierarchy and fear. Sakamaki's post-repatriation life was complicated by his status as the first prisoner, which carried particular shame in traditional Japanese culture. Yet he eventually wrote a memoir about his experiences that included extensive reflection on his time in Hawaii. The Americans showed him that even in captivity, life had meaning, that work had dignity, that human beings could be more than their military or national identities. The Hawaiian pineapple plantations continued operating for decades after the conflict, though increasingly mechanization reduced labor needs. Some of the irrigation systems and efficiency improvements developed during the prisoner work program remained in use for years. But the deeper impact was human rather than economic. Hundreds of men who had been indoctrinated to see Americans as inferior adversaries encountered a reality that completely contradicted that indoctrination. They experienced treatment that honored their humanity even while restricting their freedom. The story of Japanese prisoners working Hawaiian pineapple fields represents something rarely acknowledged in discussions of the conflict: the possibility of maintaining human decency even toward those recently engaged in hostilities. It demonstrates that how prisoners are treated reveals the values of the capturing power far more clearly than any propaganda or official statements. For the prisoners themselves, the experience was transformative, precisely because it was so unexpected. They had prepared themselves for brutality and encountered fairness. They anticipated mockery and received instruction. They expected to be broken, and instead were given opportunities for productive work and personal growth. The irony they initially perceived in being assigned to agricultural labor gave way to recognition that this work offered something their military service never had: the satisfaction of creating rather than destroying, of building rather than breaking, of contributing to life rather than dealing in conflict. The pineapple fields of wartime Hawaii became unlikely classrooms where former enemies learned that the categories of friend and foe, superior and inferior, were far more fluid and complex than military propaganda suggested. The simple act of treating prisoners with basic human dignity created transformations that military victory alone could never achieve. These transformations rippled outward beyond individual prisoners. Some returned to Japan and became advocates for agricultural development, applying Hawaiian techniques to rebuild their nation's food production. Others became voices for reconciliation, arguing that their treatment as prisoners proved that former enemies could find common ground. The guards and civilian workers who interacted with these prisoners were also changed by the experience. They learned that treating adversaries with dignity did not require ignoring or minimizing the serious nature of the conflict. They discovered that security and humane treatment were not mutually exclusive. Sergeant Chen, who rose to the rank of Master Sergeant before retiring from military service, later worked in veterans affairs and prisoner rehabilitation programs. He credited his wartime experience supervising Japanese prisoners with teaching him that redemption and transformation were possible even in the aftermath of serious conflict. The plantation foreman Santos continued managing agricultural operations until his retirement in 1962. He frequently spoke about the prisoner work program as proof that people could overcome profound differences when united by shared labor toward common goals. The broader historical significance of this unusual chapter lies in what it reveals about the relationship between ideology and experience, between what people are taught to believe and what they actually encounter. The Japanese prisoners arrived in Hawaii with worldviews constructed by years of military indoctrination. Every day of working on those pineapple plantations contradicted that indoctrination. Every fair interaction, every instance of decent treatment, every moment of mutual respect between prisoner and guard or civilian worker undermined the foundation of beliefs that had sent them into conflict. This process of forced re-evaluation, through direct experience rather than argument or propaganda, suggests important lessons about how beliefs change and how reconciliation becomes possible. Abstract arguments about values or principles rarely overcome strongly held convictions. But lived experience, repeated consistently over time, can accomplish what rhetoric cannot. The prisoners did not come to respect their captors because they were convinced by arguments about democracy or human rights. They came to question their prior beliefs because their actual treatment consistently contradicted what they had been taught to expect. This historical episode also illuminates the practical wisdom of adherence to international agreements regarding prisoner treatment. The United States' commitment to these agreements, even when dealing with adversaries who did not reciprocate, served American interests in multiple ways. It denied Japanese propaganda claims about American brutality and created conditions where prisoners became cooperative rather than resistant. For the broader effort, the prisoner work program solved practical problems related to labor shortages and prisoner management. But its significance extended far beyond these immediate practical benefits. It created a population of former adversaries who returned home with direct experience, contradicting their government's propaganda. The story of these Japanese prisoners and Hawaiian pineapples reminds us that even in the midst of devastating conflict, maintaining humanity is possible and valuable. It demonstrates that how we treat those we have overcome reveals our true character more clearly than how we treat those we favor. The lessons from those pineapple fields in wartime Hawaii extend far beyond that specific time and place. They speak to fundamental questions about how human beings relate to one another across boundaries of nationality, ideology, and conflict. They demonstrate that propaganda and indoctrination, no matter how intensive, cannot withstand the sustained experience of contradictory reality. For the men who worked those fields, both prisoners and those who supervised them, the experience became a defining chapter of their lives. It taught them that human beings are capable of maintaining their values even under difficult circumstances, that former enemies can find common ground, and that the categories we use to divide humanity are far less absolute than we often believe. The pineapple plantations of wartime Hawaii were, in their own way, laboratories of human possibility. They demonstrated that even in the midst of global conflict, even between peoples taught to see each other as irreconcilable enemies, connection and transformation remain possible. That possibility, realized through the daily work of harvesting fruit under the Hawaiian sun, stands as a testament to the resilience of human decency and the potential for reconciliation even in the darkest of times. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.